Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning if you are in California. Good afternoon if you are on the East Coast on Europe. Thank you for joining us. This program is sponsored by the Stanford Deans of Engineering, Humanities and Sciences, and Medicine, and by Chemical Engineering, and by Continuing Studies. If you're not familiar with the program, LASER stands for Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. Go to lasertalks.com and you'll find out everything about it. We've had literally hundreds of speakers from all sorts of disciplines, and we're pretty good at posting the videos. There are now laser series in more than 50 universities worldwide, and go to leonardo.info if you want to learn, if you want to find out if there's a series near your location. Again, go to lasertalks.com to find out more. I don't want to waste time, especially the lunchtime lasers. Most of our people have only 1 hour. We have 2 speakers today. I will introduce each one separately. I'm pleased that they are in completely different disciplines, which is the spirit of the lasers. Before I introduce Alexander, let me say to the scientists and engineers who right now are trying to click on stop and leave the conversation. If you think that Rilke has nothing to do with science, let me mention that the physicist Brian Greene, you may know it as the author of the Elegant Universe. Don't remember the title of his latest book. He ended up teaching Rilke's Elegies, which had been in the translation of the mathematician Klein. And I invite physicists to read Gravity's Law, a poem from Book of the Hours, Buddha in Glory from New Poems. And whether you're a scientist or not, if you want to know why we exist, you should definitely read the 9th Do We Know Elegy. Anyway, I don't want to spoil Alexander's presentation. Alexander Sorenson is assistant professor of German studies at Binghamton University. He has written The Waiting Water, Order, Sacrifice, and Submergence in German Realism, I believe published last year. And he's currently working on a new book project tentatively titled Ecologies of Transience. And that's it from my side. The podium is yours. And again, I am going to turn off my video and I ask Harpreet to do the same. Harpreet, is up to you if you want to listen to this Rilke conversation.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's coming through. Great. Well, then I will go ahead and get started. First, a word of thanks to Piero for organizing these talks and for the kind invitation to me to participate in them today. Thanks also to everyone here for spending part of your afternoon with us. And I suppose thanks also to anyone out there in the future who may find themselves watching or listening to this down the road in one form or another. So it's often advised that if you don't know how to end a presentation, an essay, or an anecdote, a quote will usually do the trick. And that's quite true advice, which I follow a lot. Today, however, I am going to adjust it slightly and begin with a quote. For sake of time, I'm just going to read the English translation, but I've also included the original German here for anyone who might be interested to follow along with it. Gradually, his attention was awakened by a hitherto unknown sensation. It was as if almost imperceptible vibrations were passing from the interior of the tree into him. He felt he had never been filled with more delicate vibrations. His body was being treated in some sort like a soul. He felt that he had reached the other side of nature. As happens sometimes in a dream, the expression gave him pleasure, and he believed it to be almost completely apt. Everywhere and more regularly, filled with this impulse, which kept recurring in strangely interior intervals, his body became indescribably touching to him, and of no other use than that he might be present in it, purely and cautiously, exactly like a ghost, already living elsewhere that sadly enters what has already been gently laid aside, in order to belong once more, though even absent-mindedly, to a world once felt to be so indispensable. He could not have told where his usual dwelling place was, but that he was returning to all this here, was standing in this body, as if in the recess of a quitted window looking forth, of that he was so convinced. So, in this remarkable passage by Rainer Maria Rilke, which comes from the first part of a short piece from 1913, simply called Experience, we see a clear example in prose of his specialty for making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. It's his poetry, however, that is most famous for this, and that's what I'll be focusing on here today. What scholars often refer to as the poetry of Rilke's middle or mature period is often regarded to have erupted into the world roughly a decade before the text we just read, soon after Rilke returned from a trip to Russia in the company of his then lover and subsequently lifelong friend, Lou Andreas Salome. The poems that Rilke began to write beginning around 1900 brim with imagery that evokes scenarios of absence taking root inside presence and continuing to grow from within. This theme is a red thread that runs through much of Rilke's middle and late work, which I'm currently exploring in a book I'm working on. In my time with you today, I'd like to sketch some of the main ideas I'm drawing from that theme and how I believe they're linked to a core and everyday source of anxiety in our own cultural moment. I'll begin tracing this red thread in the first major work of Rilke's middle period, the Book of Hours, which Piero has referred to already, in which the speaker of the poem implores God to give us each our own death. Grant us the dying that comes forth from that life in which we knew love, grappled with meaning, felt need. For we are only the rind and the leaf. The great death which we all bear within is the fruit round which it all revolves. And in a sense, everything I'm going to be talking about today is basically summed up in these remarkable verses. So they're worth reading and rereading. But to move things along, we can find echoes of them as well in Rilke's first and only novel, The Notebooks of Malte Lorenz Brigge from 1910, when the narrator notes that the desire to die your own death is becoming more and more rare. Previously you knew, or you sensed, that you had your own death within you, as the fruit contains its seed. And in the slightly earlier new poems, published in two volumes in 1907 and 1908, this motif recurs with a pulse-like regularity, even as its outer form shifts from text to text. For instance, in The Rose Interior, we're shown a group of roses and told how many let themselves fill up with inner space until they overflow and stream into the days, which keep on closing more and more completely. An inner surplus grows, much like the flower that houses it, then spills out into the open and suffuses space as well as time, both of which are emphasized as increasing and ceasing or closing in equal proportion. And then there's the variation of this motif that we find in Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. Many of its interpreters have understood Eurydice as a counterpoint to Orpheus, who leads the charge out of Hades with long strides and an impatient gaze. Eurydice's inward attunement once again leads us to a vision of death as a little kernel of absence that both inhabits and determines our presence and life. Here, though, that function extends even into what comes after life. As the shade of Eurydice follows behind Orpheus, we hear of how she was within herself, and her having died filled her like abundance. Like a fruit with sweetness and night, she was filled with her great death, which was so new that she understood nothing. The pattern I've been tracing in these last few texts centers upon the idea that our own death exists in, or even as, our innermost core. In broad terms and among much else, I think what it communicates is the basic ambivalence involved in our relation to ourselves, as well as our difficulty in articulating that relation. In this respect, Rilke is part of a very long cultural tradition, which includes everyone from Heraclitus to Heidegger, and probably many other names that start with H as well. In the time I have here, though, I'll probably just briefly mention one figure from this tradition that I think helps to illuminate one of Rilke's most crucial insights. The 5th century theologian St. Augustine of Hippo is famous for numerous sayings, but the one I have in mind is one of his pithier predicates for God. You were more inward than my most inward part, and higher than the highest element within me. As the contemporary scholar of religious thought Thomas Carlson has suggested in his recent work, there is a powerful connection between the consciousness of one's own mortality and Augustine's description of God as that which is simultaneously the most intimate and knowable part of me, interior intimo meo, and that which is also most wholly other, unknowable, ungraspable, and ineffable, superior sumo meo. That is, if I replace the idea of God with that of my own death, I, as a modern subject, may well find myself on nearly identical psychological and existential ground. To conceive of my own eventual absence from the world is inevitably to get pulled right to the core of who and what I understand myself to be. And lingering in that mental space, more often than not, brings about a kind of ontological vertigo in which my own death can indeed feel at once more inward than my most inward part, and more outward than the outermost element within me. I think Rilke's recurring image of death as a kind of fruit that we bear within ourselves is very much in tune with this idea of Carlson's, since Rilke's poetics, as we've seen, repeatedly suggest that it's our finitude that is at the heart of who we each are, that makes us what we most authentically are, precisely by virtue of being that which we can never comprehend or even experience directly. It's simultaneously our innermost and our outermost, the most strangely familiar and the most intimately strange. Or to briefly shift my language and references a bit, I'm riffing here on Hegel as well as on Heidegger. What I'm picking up on in these texts by Rilke is the sense that in order to know and articulate myself to myself, I ultimately need to stand outside of myself in order to find myself within that which is most other to me, so that I can then receive myself back in a more immediate way, like an unexpected gift from a stranger. In other words, I have to exist in the world ecstatically, from the Greek ekstasis, to stand outside of. One of Rilke's last works, the Duino Elegies, also aforementioned, is all about navigating these relationships between the familiar and the strange, the sayable and the unsayable. The symbol that Rilke uses in the elegies for the absolutely non-human, unknowable, immortal domain of reality is the angel. The angel knows, experiences, thinks, and says everything that we can't as finite, bounded, temporal, and temporary mortals. However, the flip side of this is that we have access to a special dimension of experience that the angel can't know or understand, namely the finitude of things. The finitude of the earth, the finitude of our own mortal selves, finitude in general. The ninth Duino elegy instructs us to praise this finite realm to the angel, not only because it's what is most familiar and sayable for us, but also because it's what is most unfamiliar and inexplicable for the angel. Praise this world to the angel, not the unsayable world, we hear in the ninth Duino elegy. And yet, in one of Rilke's most beautiful twists, at the end of the ninth elegy, we discover that precisely because the world we inhabit is temporary, transient, and knowable, it becomes the greatest mystery of all. Paradoxically, it becomes most fully a mystery as soon as it's no longer outside of us, but suddenly intertwined with us anew. Earth, my dearest, I will. Oh, believe me, you no longer need your springtimes to win me over. One of them, oh, even one, is already too much for my blood. Namelessly, I have belonged to you from the first. Look, I am living. On what? Neither childhood nor future grows any smaller. Superabundant being wells up in my heart. So, what can we make of all of this? I think a helpful way to go would be to work our way backwards through what we've just read, where nature appears as a site of ecstatic exchange between the world and the poet's own interior, which overflows onto the page and back out into the world. But that outward movement into the world is itself the result of the earth having already been brought inside, where it is transformed and then fills up the heart in order to spill back over in a reciprocal fountain-like movement. The zone of difference between world and earth, along with their respective assignments for the poetic voice, ultimately comes forth as a place of exchange where the innermost interior of the poet conveys itself within and via language into the countless relations and things of the world from which it receives and into which it then re-infuses the meaning that we find in it. In turn, the earth suffuses the poet's heart with the foundational and equally ineffable coordinates of life's experience and of the experience of life, which flow back out at last into the midst of things, uniting poet, heart, earth, and world. What language has brought inside is also what saturates the heart, namely the two temporal extremes of human life, the past of childhood, as well as all that waits in the future, with death at the very end. What wells up in the heart is thus transience, a way of being in the world that does not just look forward to the horizon of the future, but also backward to childhood, birth, and everything that preceded our individual entrances into the world. Transience is not just another word for finitude or mortality, though, but designates the quality of passage or transfer from particular moments, places, and conditions into other ones. What Rilke's poetry suggests, and here's the kicker, is that it's within transience that both the future and the past can become present to me in every instant, and that it is this charging of the heart's place by time that overwhelms me and impels me to speak again and continue the fountain-like cycle. That cycle is a process of taking the world inside of me through language, or in Augustine's terms, a process of making it innermost to me, interior intimo meo, so that it can become simultaneously outermost to me, superior sumo meo, as it floods and overflows my heart. So, what I take away from these motifs of Rilke's poetry and what is thrown into dramatic relief by our current cultural moment of fascination as well as anxiety vis-a-vis AI, the singularity, and other techno-futurist mainstays is this. Our temporary time on this earth and our close intimacy with the things, animals, places, and people that we constantly think and speak about can, in the blink of an eye, appear as most familiar and as most strange if we see them authentically. From the Rilkean vantage that would allow for such seeing, this knowable intimacy can reveal fully what somehow also remains most hidden, such that the incomprehensibility of our own transience, when reflected back from the world and its otherness, can end up giving us to ourselves in the most immediate way. As a result, it could be that what most allows us to dwell in the world and the world to dwell in us is precisely that incomprehensibility and our pursuit of it. That shared residence of self and world is located at the innermost core of each of us, filling us, quote, like a fruit with sweetness and night, end quote. Yet, as was also the case for Eurydice in the poem I've just referenced, that transient interdwelling is also what is most beyond our understanding. It's the hidden heart of self, other, earth, and world that says everything to us, even as we struggle to find the words. Luckily, though, we have Rilke to help us out with that part. ChatGPT will just have to get in line. Thank you all so much for listening.
Alex, very good. Very good. Very good introduction. Now, we'll probably lose most of the audience soon, but if you have time, it would be nice for the video to have a little more discussion on some of the themes that I find intriguing.
Sure.
So I'll shoot a number of things. Okay, let's first shoot a number of things that are about connections, okay? And you choose which ones and how much time you have. Let me start. He was born in Prague, born and raised in Prague. Famous writer, born and raised in Prague. I think everybody knows the answer, Kafka. But nobody would ever say that Rilke was a Czech writer, of course. So, I mean, any connection with Kafka. Then he lived, he started the Duino elegies, why they called Duino, near Trieste. Which famous writer was living in Trieste at that time? James Joyce, besides Italian writers. Um, um, Rilke was definitely multinational. I don't know how many languages he spoke, but he traveled to Russia. He met Lev Tolstoy. Then he went to Paris and he worked for Rodin, right? He wrote a monography and he was physically, I think, his assistant, his secretary, something. And then Italy, and then, of course, Germany, Munich. Um, and I think it travels the world. So, how did this impact his his world? And I find it particularly fascinating because both in Duino and at the end in Switzerland, uh, he seemed to like isolation. He picked places, castles, right, where he was in isolation. So this was a traveler. I'm a traveler, but I'm not in isolation. I don't like to live in isolation. So and then the other connection is with the visual arts, which I haven't seen much discussion about. He lived for a while, 1 or 2 years, at this German artist colony. I don't remember the name, but I'm sure you do. And
Swamp
right. And he worked with Rodin in Paris. I think he was neighbor. And then he ends his life in Switzerland. Why Switzerland? Because an art collector gave him this castle, right? By the way, I'm very jealous that Rilke managed to have all these rich people fund this. his existence. Anyway,
It
so
was a talent of his, yeah.
there are connections also with visual arts. So you decide which ones to pick, but basically, I'm 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 trying to work out the network here of influences on this great poet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, network, I think, is the right word. I mean, one thing we could point out kind of more colloquially maybe is that Rilke is kind of like Waldo in those children's books. Where's Waldo? He pops up absolutely everywhere and he seems to know everyone in some way, sometimes very directly, sometimes through these very close social networks. And as you say, in addition to these very famous figures that he knew personally and the really almost courtly relationships of patronage that he cultivated in order to be able to support himself in at a very high standard. Um, Alongside all of that, as you pointed out, he is also quintessentially the poet of solitude and of introspection and of being out at the edge of things. And that I think connects in a way to your initial question of all of these uh, points of resonance with someone like Kafka, for example, not only from the same city, but also someone who spoke multiple languages, had multiple aspects, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony, of their own identity, kind of how they understood themselves socially, culturally, etc. Um, and this image of networks or of the nodal point with all of these areas of connection and proximity to others that forms a whole, but also exists as its own distinct entity. That kind of fractally repeats itself in so many aspects, not just of his biography, but also of his poetry too, which is so often, particularly in this middle and late period that I was focusing on here, is so much about a singular instant or a singular object, an absolutely individuated experience that in the blink of an eye almost mystically gets folded into these much broader, potentially collective, even universal ways of thinking about the world and time and life and all of the rest. And yet they're often very, with the exception of something like the Duino elegies or the sonnets to Orpheus, these late works, which are very complex and very, very long. But in his middle period, he's known especially for these very short, often very symmetrical, complete little poems that are on the page very simple to look at, and in some respects are very simple in terms of their form and content. They're often describing an aspect of a thing or a place or a moment, and yet they also have this universality to them. So that way of being in between or on the threshold of these different categories, which is a big part of his own life, his own biography, but also something that really comes through in his writing and in the way that he writes about the world around him. Those thresholds, and particularly the threshold between the singular and the universal, or the individual, the particular and the whole, and the way they blend in and out of each other and they ramify into each other. That's one of the things that makes him so compelling. I mean, certainly to me, and I think I'm not alone in that. And that's part of the enigma of him. So, in the same way as someone who's off on his own, overlooking the Adriatic Sea at the Castle of Duino, or shut away in Switzerland in the middle of winter, or in the middle of the social life of Paris or of Munich, um, that it is the same figure, and that all of this in some way informs who he was and how he saw the world. I think that's definitely at the center of what is so striking to him, or so striking about him to so many people. So.
Yeah, what is also striking to me is that usually it's easy to detect an influence, but if I read Rilke, it's really hard to see the influence of the visual arts. Although he lived in an artist colony, he worked for Rodin, but I don't see that. So it really remained pretty unique. pretty.
Well, yeah, he's interesting because he has so many poems that are about not just the way something might appear in the visual plane, but specifically about artworks. And sculpture, painting, various forms. And his wife was herself a sculptor, and that was part of the connection to Rodin, actually. And as you say, he many of his very close friends, people in his life were also artists. Um, so and as far as I know, he didn't really dabble in the visual arts himself, other than through his poems, through his writing. And that seemed to be one of his fascinations was again that threshold between the word and the image, right? The seen and the spoken or the read. Um, and he seemed to be very invested in that relationship to the same degree that people who read him are invested in that a lot of the time.
And when you mention the rose in that poem, then
Mm.
you reminded me he wrote his own epigraph for his tomb.
Mm.
And it's
Hmm.
about the rose. They calls it contradiction, right? Pure contradiction.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me. It's a famously very difficult, just syntactically to figure out what the language is actually saying, but
That was
the
my question.
the foreground is
What
is
the
is the
hell does
rose,
it mean?
which is an image for him. Yeah.
Yeah. But the rose. Anyway, so that brought back the theme of death. And again, I'll throw in a couple of things. Number one, was World War One in his poetry? I mean, he lived through one of the worst massacres in the history of the world. Was the war in all of this?
Mm.
And then there's a letter. This one I have to read. He wrote to I don't remember who, but anyway, death is our friend precisely because it brings us into absolute and passionate presence with all that is here, that is natural. Anyway,
Mhm.
tell us about that and actually the missing big death of World War One in his book.
Yeah. Well, so what scholars often point out is that he wrote close to nothing during those years, and it was something that I mean, he was a prodigious letter writer, and that continued. And in his letters during that time, he referred to his writer's block, essentially, or what were called the years of silence, where he produced close to nothing. And it was definitely, I mean, you could read it through kind of a Freudian lens of this trauma that immobilizes language in some way. Um, and like everyone in Europe at that time, he personally knew people who were killed in this conflict. So it had the same effect on him that it had on so many other artists and writers of the time. And for someone who was so prolific, it really stands out as this period where suddenly he- the words just weren't there, or they weren't of use, or they weren't of service, for whatever reason from his perspective. And it's this amazing blank spot in his career, which is just surging along before that, and then famously in 1922, where he's holed up in Switzerland in the winter. The Duino elegies and the Sonnet Orpheus just kind of explode in this. He called it a savage creative storm. It's like a hurricane, right? Of the soul, I think he called it. But in the middle is this great silence, right? Where the words weren't there, and maybe shouldn't have been, right? So there's a lot to think about there in terms of uh, the importance of the image of roses and of flowers in general. One little biographical point that's maybe kind of interesting to know is he was quite ill towards the end of his early death, but what precipitated his actual death was that he was cutting roses from the garden and pricked his finger and it got infected, and it that was sort of the catalyst for his final descent into paralysis and death soon after. So Roses literally played kind of a direct role in his actual death. Um, but in his poems, one of the things I was tracing in the excerpts that I looked at was again one of these mysterious thresholds or points of conversation between what would seem to be opposites, right? On the one hand, the image of the botanical, of growth, of life, of flourishing, of coming into being and appearance in the sense of physis, right? That old word for nature coming up and out of itself into unconcealment. Um, and and everything that goes along with that floral, spring-like imagery that is everywhere in his work. And at the same time, then the idea of death, of demise, of disappearance, of decay, frailty, etc. And as is often the case, Rilke dissolves the boundary between those and brings them together and continually uses this motif that I traced of death being something that grows, almost like a plant or a fruit, right? Death being something that sustains and that conditions everything that is present, everything that is alive and still growing and still kind of moving forward in time and in space. And yet the image is that death is kind of the kernel or the core of all of that, rather than this terminal endpoint or negation to it. And it just completely flips the script of how we normally think about those two categories. And it happens on the level simply of images, using the imagery of fruit and of core and of kernel and of growth. And you can follow that then all the way down, all of the more philosophical and conceptual implications and ramifications of those images, and think about, well, what would it really mean to reconceptualize absence or transience, not as the opposite or the end point or the horizon of life and growth and continuation and activity and all of that, but actually as some sort of constitutive core or conditioning factor of it. Um, and that's, that basic idea is what my current book project is exploring, is to really think through the ecological implications of that way of thinking, that way of conceptualizing how absence and presence, death and life, transience kind of as the threshold again between them, um, how that plays a role in the way we not just regard our own lives and biographies and so forth, but more particularly the way we think about those interconnections, interspecies, organic, anorganic, etc., that the first presentation was also touching on. So Rilke is again in the same way that he's popping up everywhere in these different social networks. For me, he's also kind of conceptually like Waldo. He just sort of his little head is popping up everywhere. Um, at least that's the impression I have, which is why I'm still working with him. So,
Yeah, and when you talk about transience, we should say two words on the ninth elegy. And you probably guessed the ninth elegy is my favorite. The first one is the one that we'll say one word also about the first one. In the ninth, he talks about the fleeting world, and he talks about us being the most fleeting
mm,
of all. And then he says that the world, the fleeting world, needs us, the
mhm,
most fleeting of all. And that's what I meant when I said, if you want to find out why we humans exist, the world
mhm.
needs us. Okay?
Yeah, 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 exactly. Um, well, that's one of the through lines of the Duino elegies that comes into the foreground in the ninth and the tenth as well. Another thing you said earlier that reminded me of the tenth elegy actually is he describes death as the intimate friend. I think it's the tenth. It may be somewhere else.
I think maybe it's
It could be
it's
the
a
ninth too as well, actually. Yeah, I'll have to go back and look. Um, but in any case, yeah, the poems are tracing this strange relationship where the world, nature, things, objects, materiality, all of this are put almost in a subservient position in a way that they depend on human logos or the poet's activity in order to exist authentically as what they are. That's certainly a big thing in the elegy, in the ninth elegy in particular. But then that can also shift and it becomes us, right? It becomes the one speaking or the one experiencing all of this that is suddenly in the passive position, right? The one being entered and infused and saturated and then kind of taken along and reintegrated into this whole that is so much more powerful and more overarching than the individual on their own terms. And there again, just that back and forth of categories kind of standing in opposition and tension and then switching places and then synthesizing in some way. It's one of the great patterns that you'll find across his work is that basic move. It's not even quite dialectical. It's not just an opposition and then some sort of coagulation of the two. It's like a constant. I mean, it's more liquid-like in a lot of ways, and there's a simultaneity to it. And then it'll every now and again appear once more as oppositional and as something that is set in contrast. So it's definitely of a piece with what his middle and late work really is known for exploring through all of these different motifs and points of focus in the content of the texts themselves.
and finally, let's see if you can give a positive spin to the first line of the first elegy. Beauty
Ah.
is nothing but the beginning of terror.
The famous line, yeah, beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror. Um, Well, it's not to wriggle out of it, but I think in a way the phrasing itself is both negative and positive. It's saying that beauty is nothing but some other quality or some other condition. So it cuts against beauty initially, nothing, but then it brings in something that beauty exists alongside or consubstantially with or even as. Um, and there too, I think that's part of this broader tendency that I was describing a second ago of it not so much being a back and forth or a tennis match of A, B, black, white, etc. But it's constantly bringing the two into each other and allowing them to switch places and then to kind of cohabitate categorically and conceptually and imagistically. And I think that very first line sets the tone in a way, in exactly the way that you mentioned, where beauty is this thing that both is and is not. Um, so it too, in some way, has presence and absence being co-constitutive of it. And maybe it's co-constitutive of the two as well. So there's always something to look at.
Was pretty good, pretty good. Okay, thank you very much. And